the workshop. Alistair, SKGB, is doing a workshop on how to use your mixer to make cool sounds, basically. Because no input mixing, he's got a book here, there's one left, they're $3. So we'll turn it over to him, about a half hour, and then we'll start doing the mics.
Yeah.
Hey guys. Okay. Yeah, that mic is up really high. Cool. I guess that works. So I'm Alistair. I also go by SKGB, and those are some things that were already mentioned that I was going to mention. But basically tonight I'm going to be talking about distortion and no input synthesis, mixing, and just like making cool sounds out of nothing, basically. I chose no input mixing and distortion to talk about because they're basically part of the same thing. They're part of the same idea and concept that within mixing, as soon as your peak indicator, the visual display you use to just watch your levels and your sound, as soon as it hits 0 decibels and then goes over and you start to see red and stuff gets kind of weird and sounds kind of strange, that's not the end, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That could often be like the beginning of something really cool. Okay, so just real quick, I'm gonna go over distortion is basically what happens. You have a mixer, like so, like so. You also have like a mixer within a digital audio workspace. I'm using just Ableton Live because that's the one that's most familiar to me. Within your mixer, you have the mixing console, the EQ, the everything that you run your sound into, and then you have preamps and amplifiers inside of there that drive your sound to the level you want it at. And basically, what distortion is, where distortion happens, is when you drive your amps to their maximum level, and then you go over just a little bit. And what happens there is your mixer tries to recreate the sound you want it to send, but it can't really do that so well, so it starts to clip your signal. A good example is you're sending in like a sine wave, which is just kind of like this. It's like a circular motion. Sending that in. When you start to distort it, when you push your amplifiers to the maximum level they can go and you start to go over, it starts to sound like a square wave. I'm gonna got an example here. Start playing it 1 second. What this is just a 909 kick drum. It's basically, it's a real simple sine wave that it hits at a high amplitude and then it just gradually decreases until it becomes nothing. So that's what it sounds like not distorted. When you start to distort it, you get something that sounds a bit like this. And some of you might recognize that as being kind of like a square wave. It's essentially what happens is the sine wave hits the roof of what your mixer can recreate, and then it clips a good portion of the top of the circle off. So if you were to like look at this waveform, it would rise like this, then form like hard square, then drop back down, form square again, and then come back up. And just sound like that. I'm also going to play, so you get more of a context within like a song of what distortion sounds like. Dubby jam going on. Then when you distort it, what you're hearing right now, it probably sounds really, really angular, really jutted, really like kind of sounding, that's digital distortion. There's essentially two different types of distortion. One is digital distortion, and the other is like analog distortion. And the main difference is within digital distortion, you have transistors within your amplifiers that are amplifying your sound, and within analog distortion, you have tube amps, which are amplifying your sound. And how they sound, basically, is like digital distortion tends to sound more crunchy, more angular, and like hard and squarey. And like analog distortion will be more warm and fuzzy, kind of like a like any old tube amp. Basically, those are the two main different types of distortion you'll ever encounter. That's not by no means to say there's only two different types in the world. There's all sorts of different types of distortion based on what amplifier and what mixer you're using. They all sound a little bit different, so you can kind of like pick and choose and figure out what you want to do with them. Okay. Distortion, it can be a sound that you want to hear. It can also be a sound that you could be using to synthesize new sounds from it. Like the example I played earlier, the kick drum. Do something like that. If you loop the kick drum when it's distorted, when it's forming kind of like a pseudo sine square wave, you get kind of like a bass tone. And then from there you can repitch it and just do kind of stuff like this. So with distortion, you can turn a kick drum into a bass line. And a lot of guys, if any of you are familiar with the Data Thrash label, a lot of those guys just do crazy stuff like that. It's a lot of fun. Let me just play another track to give an example of that. You can hear like the high pitch sounds. Those were actually they were samples of great like cymbals and hi-hats that were just driven to the maximum and then heard a little bit more, and they sound, I don't know, they sound like birds to me. I kind of like that. So just left it in there. So yeah, with distortion, you can step on your microphone cable. You can also create completely new sounds that you can't hear anywhere else. It's just like a new form of synthesis. That's fun. Okay, I'm gonna start like messing around with my mixers now, kind of doing stuff I shouldn't be doing, but I'm gonna do it anyway. The next thing I want to talk about is no input synthesis. The idea of using your mixer as a musical instrument. Like you may have seen me perform before as SKGB. And you may have noticed that I have like a couple mixers on stage. It's because usually one is just running all my sound out to speakers. The others could be used as like musical instruments. Okay. Okay, so what was going on was you have this mixer, it's kind of big, it's fun, I've had this mixer forever. What you do is you create a feedback loop, and as your sound gets louder and louder and louder, it runs more sound back into the mixer, and within a fraction of essentially zero time, it's getting infinitely loud as possible, and what you're just hearing is clipping. Like you have a cable run from what I usually do is the monitor source or like a headphone out. Then you just run it back into any one of the channels. And then just turn the gain up a bit. And you can just do stuff like that. Basically, what's happening there what's going on is you're within the feedback loop, you're constantly sending a signal that's constantly getting louder and louder. And your mixer, instead of your volume knobs being used as volume knobs, they're instead being used as pitch knobs. Like if I drive the volume higher, it gets lower. As I let more sonic pressure in, it gets higher. Essentially what's going on, the way I like to think about it, is there's kind of, within the feedback loop, you're creating a gate that's controlled by your volume, your level, and your gain knobs. And how the gate works is you're constantly running back this infinitely looping signal, and the higher you drive your volume, the wider you open the gate. As you open the gate, more the signal itself gets stretched, and as it gets stretched, it gets lower. The more narrow your gate is, the higher your signal is, because the waveform itself is pulling tightly and tightly. It's getting pressed closer and closer together. So yeah. Actually, the sound itself should be sounding like a sine wave. It's a bit scratchy and kind of distorted because this mixer itself, the knob that I'm turning inside of it is kind of broken. But yeah, all different mixers have different sounds depending on where they came from, depending on if they were made in China or not, depending on how clean the knobs are within the electrical circuit itself. Another cool thing you can do, so you have your feedback loop going on. Just gonna leave it there. And from here, it's gonna sound pretty much the same as every other no input mixer you have, but you can actually start to do some little pseudo synthesis if you run a effect loop in there. I'm just gonna turn on some flanger and see what happens. So flanger tends to give the signal more of a harsher tone. If you add a delay, you can start to get rhythmic qualities out of it, which is kind of fun. You can also, if any of you are familiar with like old dub, kind of reggae stuff, you can create a dub siren. It's kind of tricky with this mixer. I usually just do this with the digital effect unit from Sorry. Okay. Another thing about no input synthesis and working with distortion in general is you're doing things that were never, mixers, amplifiers were never designed to do these things, so kind of chaos can occur when you're performing with instruments in this manner. If you're comfortable with working with chaos, it's a lot of fun. It's also just a lot of fun to experiment with, create your own sounds. Okay, that's basically it.
Yeah.
I have a book for sale for $3 if you guys would like it. It's an adventure in distortion as well as a guided meditation on no input synthesis. Cool.